Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first US 285 and South Broadway Public Information Meeting. My name is Jake Warren. I'm a capital projects engineer in the Public Works Department, as well as the project manager for the 285 and Broadway project. With me here tonight to talk about the project are a few representatives from our consultant, Atkins North America, and I'll go ahead and let them introduce themselves.
Good evening. Hi, this is Dan Little. I'm with Atkins. I'm the consultant project manager for the project.
Hi everyone, my name is Jamie Archambault and I'm the lead traffic engineer.
Carol, it looks like you're muted still.
Sorry about that. I'm Carol Coates and I'll be the environmental lead on the project.
Okay, so before we get started, I just want to point out the ability to type in questions during the presentation. At the top right corner of the stream, you guys should be able to see a little speech bubble with a question mark in it. If you click on that, you should be able to see a tab open up with a button that allows you to ask a question. So at the end of the presentation, the project team will go through questions and answer them as best we can. Shorter questions and answers may be addressed in the chat, while more complicated ones will be answered on the stream. In addition to providing information on the project, this meeting is intended to solicit feedback from Englewood residents and any interchange users. So I do want to encourage you guys to take this opportunity and voice any thoughts or concerns you have on the project. With that said, if you find yourself with additional questions after the meeting, feel free to email me. You can find my email on the project webpage on the City of Englewood website. So I'll start off the presentation by providing a brief background on where this project started and where things. All right, I'm sorry about that. We had some technical difficulties. Hopefully everybody got back into the rebroadcast that we set up. Otherwise, we'll try to publish a recording of this meeting after the fact. We'll share it to the email list and make it accessible on the web page. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump back right in from where I left off. So the city recognized for some time that there were some major needs for improvements to this interchange. There are apparent deficiencies with safety, comfort, and traffic flow implications. For example, the lane drops, which create a traffic bottleneck, short merge lengths, poor lines of sight, making for difficult and quick decision making, and narrow, unprotected sidewalks, leaving pedestrians at risk to vehicle traffic. The improvements proposed for this project will be crucial to Englewood's continued growth and development and will have significant impacts on the success of the city as a whole. So in early 2019, staff submitted an application for the Denver Regional Council of Governments 2020 to 2023 Transportation Improvement Program. Upon being granted the funds, staff worked with CDOT to develop an intergovernmental agreement, which was presented to City Council for approval on May 28th of 2020. This agreement, which is required for all federally funded local agency projects, sets the terms for utilizing the awarded funds and dictates things like which agency will manage the project, which agency will be responsible for maintenance, and when the funds must be spent. So following execution of the IGA, the city solicited engineering services through a public request for proposals. 11 different engineering teams submitted proposals, and ultimately Atkins Engineering was selected as the most qualified firm. Atkins has been working on the project since December and has been busy establishing site conditions, generating traffic models, and researching environmental resources. So this project has 3 sources of funding as shown on this graphic. We have federal grant dollars awarded through the DRCOG Transportation Improvement Program. We have state dollars provided through CDOT for the removal of a signalized intersection on 285, and we'll get into more detail on that later in the presentation. And we have local dollars provided from the city's Public Improvement Fund. And one thing I want to point out is that this is a tight budget for a project of this scope, and this budget's going to impact many of the decisions made later on in the design process. So lastly, before I let the Atkins team dive into some of the project details, I want to go over the primary goals of the project. And those are, we want to improve traffic flow on US 285, primarily by constructing an additional through lane in each direction under the bridge. We want to improve safety for all users throughout the interchange. We want to improve the aesthetics and branding of the interchange to create a gateway to downtown Englewood. We want to improve the multimodal experience. That would be primarily the experience for bicycle and pedestrian users. And we want to improve the interchange drainage characteristics to eliminate or reduce the frequency of flooding. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jamie.
Great, thanks, Jake. So first off, we'll get started by talking about the project study area. And again, just to orient you to the project, Broadway is shown there in the middle of the graphic with US 285 from left to right. The yellow line shows approximate construction limits. As Jake mentioned, we're still very early on in the project, and so this is an approximation, but ultimately the goal is to keep all of the improvements within the existing right-of-way. So now I'll walk through some of the project conditions. As Jake mentioned, as part of the project, we want to widen US 285 to 3 lanes under the bridge in order to relieve the bottleneck that occurs when the lanes drop at the interchange. That lane drop creates some safety issues, and we'll dive into those in a minute, and also causes pretty extensive queuing and congestion along the corridor. In addition, there are several other access locations that are closely spaced in between the intersections that create safety issues. So we're going to look at all of these things, and as Jake mentioned, improve safety for all users within the study area. So as I mentioned, there's extreme queuing that happens during the morning and evening peaks. So what you see here, the blue arrows show queuing that occurs during the morning peak, and then the orange arrows are showing the queuing during the PM peak. And so some of the other elements to note is, there is congestion that's occurring further to the west due to the lane drop again at Santa Fe, but that's kind of outside the study area. The other element I want to point out are the letters that you see, which are the level of service, and so that tells us how well intersections are operating and handling the demand that's placed upon them, and that's a graded system between A through F, with A operating very well and F failing. And so we do have several locations that are reaching that failure point. So looking at some of the crash history, we pulled data from January of 2016 to June of 2020. And during that time period, there were approximately 372 crashes that occurred between the intersections of Cherokee and Logan. And so the graphic that you see on the left shows the crash severity. The blue number, that 317, about 85%, resulted in property damage only. So nobody injured in those crashes at all, with about 14% injuries, and then we did have, unfortunately, 3 fatalities that happened in the corridor as well. The graphic on the right shows the distribution by crash type. And one thing I really want to point out about this graphic is that gray piece of the pie. That is side swipes, which are overrepresented in the corridor. And that's partially due, as I mentioned earlier, to the lane drop that occurs, some of the access spacing that creates those issues within the corridor. So those are some of the elements that we want to try to correct for to eliminate some of these crash types. So diving in a little bit to some of the specific crashes at some of the access points within the corridor. And these aren't all of them that are occurring, but focused on those crashes that occur as vehicles are trying to turn left. So those tend to be your more severe crashes, your broadside crashes, approach turns. And so you can see that there's several crashes that are occurring at all of these access points. One other crash type of note is you'll notice at the Sherman Street location, what's called the overtaking turn. And so what that is for vehicles that are traveling eastbound on US 285, if they attempt to either change lanes at that location or turn at Sherman Street and crash into a vehicle coming on to 285 from the Broadway on-ramp, that is that movement that's occurring. So all of these things are elements that we want to try to improve throughout the project. The other element of note here are the green stars that you see. Those are locations where pedestrian crashes occurred within the corridor. So you can see at the Broadway and the westbound ramp, there were 3 pedestrian crashes at that location, 2 pedestrian crashes at Sherman, and another 2 at Logan. So we'll be diving into some of these crash patterns to identify improvements to eliminate those, as I mentioned. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carol.
Thanks, Jamie. So because there's federal funds involved in this project, we are required to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires that we identify all potential environmental impacts that could result from the project. It also requires that we work to avoid, minimize, and mitigate those impacts. And for this corridor or this project, the main resources that need to be analyzed are air quality, noise, biological resources, historic resources, and recreational resources. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Dan.
Thanks, Carol. Next slide. So as you've heard from Jake, Jamie, and Carol previously, we have the project goals. We've been studying the traffic conditions, the accidents for the project, and from those we've developed conceptual alternative options. We have 3 options that we've identified so far. What you see on the screen here is option A, which is really the option to what we call the existing diamond interchange configuration. And in this configuration, we're generally matching a lot of the existing conditions of the interchange that are there today with improved geometry at certain locations to bring it up to current standards. The interchange was constructed quite a while ago, and there's current more improved standards, so we'll bring it up to standards. Under this option, you'll see the ramp intersections with South Broadway are in the same location as they are today. And then what this option does is it generally matches existing facilities. It helps us minimize reconstructing some of the ramps and potentially saving cost for the project. Some of the improvements that you'll see in option A, which are in all of the options, would be one point is Sherman Street signalized intersection with US 285 will be eliminated, removed. That signalized intersection, as Jamie talked about, is a traffic condition. It's causing some of the accidents. So that signal will be removed. The access from Sherman Street onto 285 will be removed under all the options. And we have a slide to talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation. So the second alternative that we've developed is, again, we call it a tight diamond interchange. And it's similar to the first one. However, what you'll notice is that the ramp intersections of 285 with Broadway have been moved closer to 285 on the south and the north. In this configuration, this creates some additional buffer space to the neighborhoods to the south, creates some buffer space to the trail and the parks to the north for the interchange. This helps us with some of the traffic operations, bringing those signals closer together so they can operate more efficiently. This does require full reconstruction of all the ramps and potentially a little bit additional cost to the first alternative. The third alternative that we have, next slide. Thank you. The third alternative that we've developed and are looking at would be what we call a single point urban interchange. And what you see here is, again, the ramps are very tight to 285, and in fact the ramps merge, and there is a one signal that operates all of the ramps together. Under this configuration, this is the best traffic operations because we've minimized additional phases of the signals for the two ramps. This again provides buffer space on the south and the north, similar to alternative B. And I will point out, as Jake mentioned before, we have limited funding on this project at this point. So this option may be more than the funding that we currently have for the project, but if this is the right solution, then we want to make sure that we understand that. So we'll be studying that as part of the alternatives evaluation. Next slide, please. We understand that the multimodal bikes and pedestrians accessing through the interchange is a significant consideration as part of the project. This is important to the values of the city of Inglewood. We know the location is central. We want to make sure that we have implemented multimodal facilities. What you see here in this slide is the South Broadway itself is a priority pedestrian corridor identified in the walk and wheel plan that the city of Inglewood completed in 2015. And as such, some of the things that we'll be doing on Broadway itself, the new bridge that will be over 285 that gets reconstructed, is we'll be looking at separating the sidewalks from the roadway to ensure that we have, a more pedestrian environment, lower stress environment. The sidewalks that are currently adjacent to the roadway just isn't great walking that close to vehicles. So if we can separate those, that's a huge improvement. We'll be looking at enhanced roadway crossings of the intersections. As Jamie mentioned before, there were some accidents that we saw with some of those ramp intersections. We want to make sure that we have enhanced roadway crossings. And then on the right-hand side of the slide here, you see there's some different options that we'll be looking at as part of the structure cross-section with wider sidewalks and trying to buffer with the street poles or bollards or maybe some landscape planters adjacent to the curb and the vehicles that travel along Broadway to create some buffer space and just a more low stress pedestrian environment across the bridge. And then again, this area here is the entryway to downtown, so we want to make sure we have wayfinding signage that'll direct folks to the downtown area as well as the medical district, and then looking at landscaping and aesthetic options as well. Next slide. So this slide here is an exhibit out of the 2015 Inglewood Walk and Wheel Master Plan. We've talked about the Broadway corridor. The Sherman Street corridor is another significant corridor within the city of Inglewood. This is identified as a bike boulevard and a enhanced pedestrian corridor as well. So we want to make sure as we're developing solutions, that we understand that, and in particular, as we talked about before, if we're going to be closing the signalized intersection at Sherman Street with 285, that we have implemented solutions associated with that, which is on the next slide here. So what you see here is an aerial image of Sherman Street on the left and then Logan Street on the right. The Safeway shopping plaza is on the north. So as I mentioned, Sherman Street is a bike boulevard pedestrian corridor, and as we close the 285 crossing at grade at street level and the signal, what we'll be doing is implementing a signing to direct bikes and pedestrians down to the Little Dry Creek Trail underneath 285 through that existing underpass bridge and back up to Sherman Street on the north side. And that way we don't have pedestrians crossing the street in a more dangerous environment. And then I think I want to close it out with a discussion about this, where we are in the project schedule. So as Jake mentioned, we got started on the project in early December. And since then we've been doing traffic studies, alternative analysis, getting us to the public meeting we have here today. We'll be taking and looking at the forecast traffic volumes, studying that with each of the interchange alternatives over the next couple of months. And we'll be coming back to another public meeting in May, at which time we're expecting to get to a point of making a selection on the preferred interchange alternative, at which time we would move into design, the environmental, finalizing the environmental approvals and compliance, as Carol talked about. And then over the rest of the year, we'll get through final plans with construction anticipated about a year from now. So it would be spring, summertime of 2022 before we would get to construction. As I mentioned, over the next several months, we'll be doing future forecasting, analysis of alternatives, getting to a preferred interchange selection in May, at which time we'll be coming back to the public to get additional comments on the additional alternatives and evaluation studies that we do. So I think with that, if we have any questions.
So I just want to jump in real quick and apologize for some of the stream difficulties we had earlier. I'm seeing in our questions we're having some concerns about being able to access the meeting recording at a later time, and yeah, we'll look to publish the presentation on the webpage as well as to the project email list. So hopefully that way you guys can see the presentation as a whole. So yeah, other than that, hopefully we can get some questions about the interchange and the project itself. So
Stephanie has a question. Her question says, will the Sherman Street closure eventually bike walk friendly versus having to detour on the underpass?
Well, there isn't really a good way to make that crossing bike and walking friendly. As Dan pointed out, it's extremely close to the interchange, and I think at this time we feel that detour is close enough that we wouldn't need to provide an alternate crossing, and with that in mind, it's not too far to the nearby intersections as well. Let's see. Looks like we have another question. It was, when was the 285 and Broadway interchange originally built? What's the typical lifespan for an interchange like this that was built decades ago? in Dan, I want to say it was built in the 60s. Do you know off the top of your head?
I think you're right, Jake, and it was built in phases. It was initially just an overpass, and then there was another project that actually added the ramps at a later time. Let me see if I can get to the original as-built plans.
Okay, yeah, I think you're right. Let's see. While you're pulling that up, Dan, I'm gonna look at the next question we got.
Yep.
So Marine's pointing out that compliance with ADA for access is important, and that's very true. Being a federally funded project and the fact that we are a government agency, any pedestrian facilities that we build are going to be ADA compliant. And Glenn is asking, will the planned closure of Sherman Street at 285 impact the small businesses in that area? It could. I will point out that I think the traffic counts from 285 to Sherman Street are currently pretty low, and also the fact that there is, as Jamie pointed out earlier in the presentation, there is a safety concern at that intersection, and that's something that we can't ignore. So while we will try our best to accommodate the small businesses in the area, you know, the Sherman Street closure is pretty critical to improving the safety in the interchange.
So we did get an answer to the age of the interchange. The bridge, which was originally built as just an overpass, was built in 1955. Typically, a structure will be a lifespan of, I think we designed now to 75 years for a lifespan. One of the reasons that we have to reconstruct the bridge itself is that it's not wide enough for the third lane on 285. So we have to reconstruct the bridge as part of that. And I think the ramps were built, you know, sometime in the 60s, probably the late 60s, early 70s is when the ramps went in. I guess the other thing that I would say about the interchange type is, I think you guys probably see it out there. Some of the geometric configuration considerations are like the ramps that come off right now are at a very sharp angle. They're hard to see unless you really know they're there. So it's those types of things are some of the geometric considerations that'll be cleaned up.
Jamie, do you want to address this next question about traffic counts?
Yeah, so the question that was asked was that you're doing traffic counts during COVID. What happens when traffic gets back to normal? We actually were lucky enough to have traffic counts taken pre-COVID. The 285 corridor was planned for some signal retiming, and counts were taken, I believe, in January of 2020. So we do have both pre-COVID and post, or I guess we're not post-COVID yet, are we? Unfortunately, and numbers from during COVID. So when we're running our existing conditions analysis, we are using pre-COVID numbers. And then when we look at our future growth in the quarter, that's all based off regional forecasts for the area.
And the next question we have is, will the Broadway bridge be torn down and reconstructed? If so, how will traffic be detoured? So yes, the Broadway bridge will be torn down and reconstructed. That's going to be necessary in order to add the additional lanes on 285 under the bridge. At this time, given how early on it is in the design process, we're not exactly sure how traffic is going to be detoured. We'll probably utilize Logan Street. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Jamie, I don't know, do you have any additional input on the potential for traffic detours?
I mean, it's something that we'll take a look at later on in the process. I think it's, part of it depends on how the bridge is constructed, but ultimately we'll be looking at ways to minimize delays. And I think Dan's got a good analogy of that, right? Is either you rip the Band-Aid off and have a little bit more impacts and do it over a shorter duration. But that's something that has yet to be determined.
Yeah, I'd say still, once we have a preferred alternative, then we'll start developing traffic plans. But I think we understand that keeping Broadway itself open is probably important, and we have some options of building the bridge half at a time. Whether we have to neck down from 2 lanes to 1 lane or have some temporary ramp closures, those sorts of things aren't quite determined yet. And certainly that'll be part of our future public meetings, some of our outreach and stuff like that. But we like to keep things open as much as possible, just because I know it's important to the businesses, the community, and those sorts of things. So.
So next question we have is, what are the 2 historic properties on the first map? Let's see if I can click back to that map real quick. So I do know that the property up north here adjacent to Hampton Avenue is the Colorado Community Banks building, the mushroom building, so to speak. And then I believe, Dan or Carol can correct me, I believe this is identified, this property southwest of the interchange is identified as a historic property because it's a certain age. It was built, I think, what was it, before 1975 or something like that?
So the two properties identified here have been previously identified as historic. Our historian is going out now and analyzing, assessing the other properties within the project area to determine if any other properties are also historic. I don't have the address off the top of my head for that property on Bannock.
Okay. Dan, do you want to take this next question about 285 traffic, Dan or Jamie?
Just so I have the right question, do you want to read it, Jake?
Where will 285 traffic be rerouted during construction? Which side streets will be impacted?
Yeah, we don't envision closures of 285 itself. That's part of the phasing that we'll do. We recognize as we tear down the bridge and we put up the new girders that we're going to have some closures. Typically what we would do in that case is those would be overnight closures, and we would route traffic up the ramps and down the other side of the ramps because we have the ability to do that under a lower volume condition. And then we can phase the construction of the interchange itself with keeping the 285 traffic open during the day.
Okay, I'll take this next question. Someone's asking about safety concerns for the path under 285, especially at night. So that's something we'll definitely look into as part of this this project, when we reroute traffic, we're going to make sure that when we route the bicycle and pedestrian traffic, that is, we'll make sure that route is safe and signed well and well lit and that sort of thing. So that's definitely a good thing to consider. Let's see.
Do you want me to take the next one, Jake, about how, question from Cynthia about how will this not cause more backups at the Cherokee light? And I can speak to a few different things. There are a few other projects that are happening in the area and upcoming that will look at some other areas of congestion. So, for example, I know CDOT is currently studying the US 85 corridor, which also includes the interchange between 285 and Santa Fe. And you know, in the westbound direction, that lane that drops at Santa Fe causes backups through Englewood all the way back to the Cherokee light. And so that study should hopefully help identify ways to improve that, that portion. Coming in the eastbound direction at Cherokee, again, by adding that third lane, that should allow some more throughput for vehicles heading eastbound. Right now, with that ramp that drops, you know, sometimes there'll be drivers that dive in at the last minute to try to bypass some of that congestion, which creates some of the safety issues that we're seeing. So that is a way that hopefully some of those queues at Cherokee will be resolved, but that's something that we'll be looking at throughout the study, looking at the future forecasts and how to make sure that operations at those intersections are sufficient. And Jake, I'll just take this other one again back to if the traffic study was done during COVID, can it be still considered valid? And as I mentioned, we were lucky enough to have counts that were already taken pre-COVID that we're using. And then essentially after we get done with our existing conditions, again, we'll be using growth forecasts for the region to identify what those future volumes will be in the area.
And maybe you want to take this traffic detours question?
I think Dan and I both hit on this one already. Again, traffic detours to be determined once we know what type of interchange that we're building and our options for constructing it. Again, trying to minimize impacts wherever possible.
Glenn is asking, will there be an outreach by the city to save these small businesses from the impact of this project? The light rail project along Butel put many small businesses out of business. That's definitely something we want to consider. We don't want to put small businesses out of business. With that said, I mean, we're looking at the traffic counts, and we feel that there's a lot of alternate routes to access these businesses. We can look into things like additional wayfinding signs for the business and things like that. So, you know, we'll definitely try to minimize the impact. Dan, do you want to address Michelle's question?
Yeah, so let me read this, and this is probably a good question for Carol, but this question is, will there be a sound barrier under the Broadway bridge with the new design? The sound now bounces off the concrete walls and keeps people up at night. especially in the summer when windows are open. As Carol mentioned before, and I'll let her touch on it a little bit more, but we are required to do a noise study as part of the project, which involves setting existing noise level, studying existing noise levels as baseline condition, and then, what the future noise levels would be after the project. So, and then developing solutions based on that. So, Carol, I don't know if you want to.
I think you pretty much covered it. Dan. We'll definitely be assessing the noise impacts, and we'll be going through a process to determine whether or not it's feasible to construct a noise wall if there are impacts. And we won't know whether or not a wall would be constructed until we go through that process. But it's definitely going to be looked at.
Yeah. Right. I can try to address this next one. The question here is there a plan for beautifying the medians on either side of the interchange? And I'd say there's how I'll answer this is there's two different medians. There's medians on 285, and then there's medians on Broadway as well. I'd say on 285, we're probably looking at potentially removing some of those medians and changing some of that configuration in order to get the width that we need to get the additional lanes through without having to widen the project to take additional right-of-way. So that's one of the ways that we're able to keep the project within the existing right-of-way and not impact adjacent properties is we can use some of that median area. And the other thing I'd say is there's so much traffic and so much going on 285 that having landscape medians on 285 it's really a maintenance safety condition. I think where we would focus our landscaping and aesthetic elements is up on top as you get off the ramps, in between the ramps. If we move the ramps closer, maybe on the outside of the ramps. And as I said before, I like trying to separate sidewalks from the roadway of 285 and then putting some landscaping or some buffer areas in there as well. The other thing I'll say about landscaping is once we have gotten a little bit further along in the project, have a preferred alternative, we'll develop landscape plans, some landscape alternatives and options. I know that's part of our scope, so looking at wayfinding and some landscaping options for the project. So, but I would say for the most part, that's going to be focused up on the top level of the interchange and not necessarily down on 285. Let me just read this next question. I think it's another landscape question. How will the project impact grading and existing trees in the interchange landscaping parklet? I noticed the sidewalk shifts to the existing roadway alignment in most options. So I think where you're talking about is the ramp on this southwest corner, and there is a row of trees between the ramp and 285 today, and we show a new ramp in that location where the ramp moves, I'll say, further to the east. And what we're looking at in there is that ramp would potentially be north and east of the existing row of trees, just basically moving the ramp from south of the tree line to north of the tree line and trying to maintain that row of trees. I do recognize that row of trees is pretty significant. It's beneficial. They're very well established. So as we look at that geometry, that was kind of how we were looking at that, was trying to save that row of trees by going to the north. As far as where the sidewalk goes through there, I think that's still something that we need to study in some of the things that, honestly, we'd like to get some community feedback on, is that if we do move the ramp closer to 285 in that location and create some additional buffer space, like, what do we do with that space in there? Is that become park space? Do we work with parks to make it more formalized? I think that's an opportunity for the community to weigh in and come up with some options and some ideas in there, and see what we can do.
Dan, do you want to take Ellis's question? If the Broadway bridge is rebuilt one half at a time, will traffic on Broadway be one lane in each direction?
I don't know the answer to that just yet, but I'll be honest, that's a consideration that we potentially will look at, and we'll have to look at the volumes associated with that and see if that's a doable situation. I don't know yet, and I can't say yes or no, but certainly I will say that's a potential that we could be looking at. There's a lot of questions about traffic control and phasing and detours, and those are legitimate questions that you guys all deserve answers to. But when we come back in the second public meeting and we have a preferred alternative, we'll come back with more definitive answers or ideas around the traffic detouring and phasing as we get a little bit further along. But there's probably as we develop the bridge one half at a time, we probably do have to look at some sort of restricted lanes, whether it's the left turn lanes or the through lanes in one direction or another. So here's and I'm sorry, it seems like my questions are bouncing around, so if I'm missing something, we can go back to it. But next question I see here is a follow-up on the detour under the underpass. The decline on the south side of Hamden at Sherman into the Little Dry Creek path is rather steep for people with disabilities, elderly. Will this be addressed? Yes, we will look at that, and thank you for the comment, because we will look at the grades and make sure that that's ADA compliant. One of the things we are looking at in there is as the north-south corridor of Sherman Street on the south side transitions to the Little Dry Creek Trail, we may have to put in some wider sidewalks, some street crossings at those intersections to adequately direct folks onto the trail. And we're looking at that trail connection probably needs to be, if it's going to be a combined multimodal, 8 to 10 feet wide as it goes down. But the grade itself, we will look at that. That's a great comment, that we need to look at that and make sure that that meets ADA compliance for maximum grade standards. So thank you for that comment. That's a great comment.
Okay, Maureen is asking, what about bike lanes and also wider sidewalks for wheelchair use? So we are looking at providing wider sidewalks, both on Broadway and on 285. And as we mentioned earlier, all the pedestrian facilities that we install are going to be ADA compliant. As far as bike lanes goes, 285 is a highway, and we probably won't be putting bike lanes along 285. And Broadway itself is a priority pedestrian corridor according to the Englewood Walk and Wheel Plan. So we're really going to prioritize pedestrians on Broadway. And we also mentioned the budget earlier, and providing that extra width for bike lanes means extra width for a bridge, means a more expensive project. So we're definitely going to be, look to be sensitive of bike usage in the area when we're talking about the Little Dry Creek Trail and how it connects to Sherman Street and 285 and Broadway, but we likely won't be building bike lanes as part of this project.
So there's a question here. I think this is a good question. For the houses and businesses south of Broadway on Sherman, are studies being done to address fire, police, and ambulance response times if the Sherman 285 intersection is removed? The answer to that is yes. We are going to have outreach to the fire department and police department for emergency response, and not just the south side, but the north side as well, to make sure that we have adequate emergency response time and that the fire department standards are met. So that's still something that we'll be doing moving forward.
So Maureen has another comment. I think a community meeting promoted at Malley Senior Center would be good to engage seniors who use the corridor. And that's a really good point. I had some discussions about this with our community development department. And I believe they have some contacts with the Malley Center and as well as some other senior groups, communities in the city. So that's definitely something we'll be looking to do, is to engage those communities and other communities of users that frequent the interchange. So it looks like Wendy is asking, will construction be done overnight? And as we kind of mentioned earlier, being pretty early on in the design phase, we really haven't ironed out those kind of details. Overnight work can be beneficial in that it limits disruptions to traffic. However, there are obviously noise concerns and additional costs associated with working overnight. So yeah, it's something that may be done, but we just haven't gotten that far yet. Jamie, do you want to take this question from Carl?
Yeah, I can take this question. So the question is, does left-hand turn onto Bannock from westbound 285 need to go away? Bannock is one-way southbound. With this project, the only access to Bannock would be a right-hand turn from eastbound 285. That's definitely something we need to look at still. At this point, we've only completed our existing conditions analysis, and I know some of these drawings do show medians, which would indicate a closure, but that has not yet been determined at this point. Having that access, and again, working with fire and emergency response to make sure that adequate access is provided is something that's really important. So that'll be some of the next steps that we're looking at, is how to provide access while also, weighing some of the safety concerns at access locations within the corridor.
And it looks like Shannon had a similar question. She asks, she says, how will traffic on Bannock be addressed with the section close to 285 in Bannock is a one-way street? We have a business on 3560 South Bannock Street.
Yeah, so again, same answer I gave to the last question. We still haven't determined how that will operate, but it's definitely something that we'll be looking at. By having that one-way configuration, it eliminates a lot of other options to get to that portion of Bannock Street. Excuse me. If that were a two-way section, there would be ways to go through the interchange navigate maybe along Jefferson to come back up, but that's not the current configuration. So we do understand that access there would be limited, and that's something that we'll be looking at further.
So it looks like Marty is asking or commenting, the project looks like it is making improvements to the greenbelt and park areas, but there is a vacant lot west of the bookstore, which is an eyesore, and the stuff around that bookstore, any improvements to that area, trees or landscaping? So if I'm not mistaken, that's, yeah, this area kind of northeast of Lincoln Street here. We probably wouldn't be looking to make improvements as part of this project. That's definitely something the city can look into. If that is city right away, maybe that's something we can talk to the Parks Department about, maybe adding some plantings and that sort of thing. So that's a good comment, and that's something we'll discuss internally. So I'm scrolling through our questions. I believe we answered all of these questions, but we'll stick around for another couple minutes in case people want to ask some more questions. So I just want to jump back in here real quick and remind everybody that you guys can, if you have questions down the road, you can always reach out to me. My email is on the project webpage, which is on the city's website. I believe my office number is on there as well. So by all means, if you have questions tomorrow or in a couple weeks, please reach out to me, and we'll do our best to answer them.
Yeah. Hey, Jake, there's a question in here about funding, and I don't know if you want to go back to that slide and maybe show that. Probably just got on a little bit late in the presentation.
Yeah, let's see.
The question is all of the funding federal for this project, or is some funding from CDOT, Arapahoe County, and Inglewood?
Yeah, so that's a good question. This slide here shows a breakdown of the funding. So we have 7.6 million provided through Dr. Cog's Transportation Improvement Program, and those are federal dollars. We also have 800,000 contributed by from state funds. Those are provided through CDOT, and then we have 1.2 million that is provided from city funds. So hopefully that answers the question. Did you guys see any other questions on there? I'm having trouble for whatever reason. I can't switch my tab back over to the questions tab.
I don't see any others that haven't been addressed.
Okay. Well, I think with that we can wrap up this meeting, and again, feel free to reach out if you guys have any questions going forward. Hope everybody has a good night.
Yes, thanks everyone.